Hi, I am Deborah Hathaway, and I'm so excited to be able to get to share with you my first chapter for my latest book, Near the Ruins of Penharrow. This is a book about Gwynna Merrick. She is a bow maiden, a female worker at one of the mines in Cornwall, and this is her story about falling in love with the mine owner's son, Jack Trevethan. So we'll just get right into it. Chapter 1, Cornwall, 1815. The soothing sound of the sea's waves coasted toward the shoreline, creeping over the cliff's edge where stood the soaring wheel-favor engine house, the mine's main building pressed up against the upper cliff behind it, as if its gray stone walls kept the land from falling forth onto the pathway before it, or farther into the sea, 300 feet below. The burnt red chimney released wispy smoke into the blue skies, and arched windows spotted the tall rectangular walls. As striking as the image was, Gwynna Merrick was captured instead by the sea. She couldn't remember the last time the water rested so calm and clear. The sun flashed against the slight swells, shifting from light blue to dark with each tepid wave, like the fabric she'd seen last market day, displayed in the windows of the modiste's shop, rich blue silk as soft as a flower's petal. Of course, Gwynna hadn't touched the fabric herself. She could never afford such a thing. She couldn't even afford a few extra hairpins, of which, incidentally, she was in great need. She told Mama the wind had stolen them, but they both knew Gwynna removed them herself, consequentially losing them one by one. She couldn't help it. Where was the joy in walking along the cliffside if she couldn't allow the wind to run its fingers through her hair? Even now, with her brown locks held back by a frayed, scanty cloth, the wind pulled stray strands out, curving them round her face and across the bottom of her nose. She pursed her lips and wrinkled her nose to scratch the tickle. The ocean responded with a deep, rumbling laugh. No, Gwynna couldn't afford fabric, pins, or even a new ribbon for her hair, but the sea was hers for the taking. A metal bell clanged behind her, sharp and jarring against the lull of the ocean, but Gwynna didn't flinch a muscle. After nearly 10 years of the disruptive chime, she'd begun to expect it, as well as the subsequent sounds that always followed. The miners singing as they ascended from the nearby shaft, the creaking of the mine's whim slowly ceasing, wheeling up the last of the kibbles filled to the brim with damp ore. Elderly maidens would soon shoo children away from the whirling gears now slowing, and barrows, spades, and hammers would drop to the ground, clinging loudly against each other or with a dull thud on the ore. The bow maidens and children working on the surface would then stretch out their aching backs and tightened arms before gathering together in groups of family or friends, situating themselves on patches of grass or heather or simply the dirt beneath their feet. Gwynna had done the very same with her father and brother once the men had made it to the surface. They'd eat pasties Mama had made earlier and swap stories about their day, hoping to feel refreshed before the bell signaled the end of crib, their midday meal, their only break. That was before, though. Now, with a new mine owner, Mr. Peter Trevethan, and a new captain to oversee the running of wheel favor, they were allotted 2 breaks per day. Papa said things were different, better. Gwynna would have to take his word for it. She hadn't worked at the mine in months. "Gwynna!" Papa. He'd finally come up. Gwynna turned, meeting his eyes with a smile. He waited on the incline beside the engine house. His hands cupped his mouth, then waved her toward him. Gwynna swept one last glance across the sea, then pulled herself up the short, steep hill. "Are you ready?" Papa asked when she reached him. His chin-length hair slid out from his tattered brown cap. The stubble growing on his jaw was darker than usual, made black by the dust and soot from the shaft. He squinted heavily, still adjusting to the bright sunshine, though the hesitation churning in his green eyes was evident. Gwynna had always loved her father's eyes. Hers were more amber-colored. "I am, Papa. You don't have to do this. We'd be managing just fine without you working here." That wasn't true, and they both knew it. No matter the help she was to her mother at home, and no matter the odd work Gwynna had found in and around St. Just, mending clothing or helping with others' harvests, her family still struggled for money, as did most miners. She eased her arm through his and led the way to the upper cliff. "I know, Papa, and I know we want me safe. 'Tis time, though." Her gentle tone did nothing to raise his sunken shoulders, but then they'd appeared such a way since June last. If her staying safe at home hadn't raised his spirits by now, it never would. 2 bow maidens sat together on a patch of grass, neither of them looking up as Gwynna and Papa passed by. A group of children ran alongside them, their laughter lifting the air. Papa maintained his somber look, but Gwynna smiled back at them, refusing to lose her resolve. Stubborn rocks, half buried in the earth, dappled the dusty pathway they ambled up. a pathway created by hundreds of footsteps coming and going to and from the mine. Those footsteps belonged to many in her family, her father, her brother, even at one time her mother. And now Gwynna was proud to have them belong to her once more. Before long, the count house rose before them, a small 3-room hut with nearly slatted walls and a roof constructed of buckling, faded wood. The structure had been there since she was a child, though small improvements had been made over the last few months, including the expansion of a spare room and kitchen. Papa tapped on the door, and a loud voice bade them enter. A resounding creak echoed as Papa opened the door, his boots thudding on the wooden floor. Gwynna quickly followed. A small hearth to the right of the room carried a few blackened logs, the fire having no doubt been left to wane as the late August sun warmed the room instead. The walls were bare but clean. The floor had been freshly swept, and 2 chairs were neatly tucked in beneath a small table pressed up against a side wall. It wasn't much to look at, but the room certainly was a great deal tidier than the last time she was there. Was this due to Mr. Trevethan as well? A single window at the far side of the room spilled light onto a small wooden desk. A gentleman sat behind it, leaning over a paper, scratching madly with his quill. Another middle-aged man spoke to him, standing in front of the desk with a fisted hand on his waist. "Of course, I'm happy to support Mr. Trevethan with my finances, but I cannot agree to attend any further meetings here. My jacket is littered with dust each time I step foot in this dingy room, and the people, well," he glanced over his shoulder at Gwynna and her father, continuing in a softer tone. "As much as one might attempt, one cannot improve the state of a miner nor his family, in manner or cleanliness." Gwynna bristled. How she despised those who thought themselves above miners. The man, still seated, continued to write, though he nodded his head distractedly. He must be the new mine captain, Mr. Harvey. Gwynna had never met him, but father said he was a just man like Mr. Trevethan. "I understand your frustrations, Mr. Pinnock," Mr. Harvey said, "but the count house is where we have all agreed to convene. If it displeases you, you are always welcome to forego the next investors' meeting." "Perhaps I will," Mr. Pinnock said. "Do tell Mr. Trevethan when you see him today." "Of course, sir." Mr. Pinnock made for the door, where Gwynna and Papa still stood. A dismissive wave from the man signaled them to move without so much of a glance in their direction, but father lingered with a raised chin before stepping aside. The gentleman sniffed, muttering as he departed from the room. "Miners, all the same, disdainful, filthy." His words were silenced as the door closed. Gwynna and Papa exchanged glances. They'd grown accustomed to such opinions from the upper class, but hearing the words still set them on edge. "Merrick?" Mr. Harvey beckoned them forward with a flick of his finger. He had yet to look up from his paper. The floor groaned as the father and daughter approached the desk. A clang from the side room, a small kitchen, drew Gwynna's attention to an older woman juggling pans in her arms. She placed them on a small shelf near a window, then turned sharp eyes on Gwynna. That was why the rooms were tidier. Mr. Trevethan had hired a count house woman to oversee its cleanliness. When her nod to the woman wasn't reciprocated, Gwynna returned her attention to Mr. Harvey, who wiped his quill free of ink and replaced the cap on the bottle. "So," he began, lacing his fingers together and leaning one elbow on his armrest, "you said you wanted to meet with me?" Papa removed his cap, his stringy hair falling over his eyes before he raked it back with his fingers. "Yes, sir, 'tis me daughter, Gwynna. She be wantin' her job back as a maiden." "I see." Mr. Harvey leaned forward in his chair once more, holding his unfinished correspondence by its corners to set it aside. He then plunked a large leather-bound book before him. "How long did you work here before you left, Gwynna?" 10 years or so, sir." His eyes met hers under a raised brow. "Might I ask why you left? Did the work environment not suit?" "No, sir, but I—" She glanced to Papa with a parted mouth. What could she say? The work environment certainly had not suited, but that wasn't why she'd left. "She be needed at home," Papa responded instead. Mr. Harvey's scrutinizing gaze shifted between them both, but he allowed them their secrets as he opened his book. "Have you any other children working here, Merrick?" "No, sir. She be all we have. Now." A hollowness expanded in Gwynna's chest, as if her heart had stopped its beating. She'd grown accustomed to such emptiness. It had been there since June, just like the constant presence of Papa's sunken shoulders. Mr. Harvey glanced up. "Casualty in an accident?" His words were brief, but his tone had softened. Papa raised his head in a sort of nod. "Yes, me son, Jago." He cleared his throat. "We lost him a few months back." She hung her head. Jago, her parents' only son and Gwynna's only sibling. He had been one of her closest friends, killed because... But she wouldn't allow herself to dwell on the accident, or how greatly she missed her brother, not when she needed her courage fortified, preserved for the work ahead. "You have my condolences, Merrick," Mr. Harvey said. "Thank you, sir." The mine captain paused, clearly wishing to say something more, but he redirected his attention to his book. He must have been as uncomfortable as Papa with the compassion he'd shown. "We've had a few bow maidens leave us recently, so you've come at the right time. I have a place in bucking that I think will suit you just fine." Gwenna dipped her head. Bucking. That was the last thing she wished to do. Crushing rocks into powder, damaging her fingers, inhaling and tasting the dust of the copper ore. The task had to be one of the most grueling assignments at the mine, and she had suffered through it for nearly 4 years before advancing elsewhere. Fortunately, Papa was not unaware of her feelings for the chore. He wrung his cap in his soot-covered fingers. "Sir, mightn't there be a place here, in the count-house? Me Gwenna be a fine cook and a hard worker." A barely discernible huff came from the kitchen. The count-house woman stared at Gwenna with beaded eyes, as if Gwenna had tracked horse manure across her clean floors. Gwenna sniffed. She couldn't smell anything beyond wet wood and smoke. "We haven't the need for more than one, I'm afraid," Mr. Harvey said, his head still bowed as he uncapped his bottle of ink. The woman raised her chin and walked triumphantly away, fiddling once more with the pans. Thank goodness there wasn't a place for Gwenna here. What a prison the count-house would be, remaining inside, cooking, cleaning, and washing day in and day out, all with that woman lording over her. She'd almost prefer bucking. Almost. With a sidelong glance, she caught Papa's eye. He was already staring down at her, shaking his head. "Please," she mouthed out. He added a lowered brow to reaffirm his refusal. They had discussed this the night before. Papa would push for the safest task for Gwenna, and she would not speak unless Mr. Harvey addressed her. She didn't blame Papa for his desire to acquire her a safe placement, especially after what happened to Jago. But this was a mine, and the duties where she could be out of harm's way were few and far between. She just couldn't go back to bucking. "Sir?" "Gwenna," Papa warned under his breath. Mr. Harvey glanced up with a quirked brow. "Yes?" Well, there it was. The mine captain was asking her a question. It would be rude not to answer him. "Sorry, Papa. I don't mean to speak out of turn, sir, but I'd be better at spallin'." "Spalling?" "Yes, sir. 'Tis what I did 'fore I left." Spalling wasn't any easier than bucking, in her opinion, what with a larger hammer and more forceful hitting, but at least then she'd be out in the open air with a view of the sea. That was always a fine distraction, and a distraction was necessary during hard labor. "Spalling," Mr. Harvey repeated under his breath, mulling the word over. Gwenna stood still as he eyed her from her boots to her head. The previous mine captain had attempted to coerce many a maiden to engage in activities befitting a woman of ill repute. Fortunately, with Papa and Jago at the mine, he'd kept his distance from Gwenna, but that didn't mean the mine captain didn't leer at her from afar, discomfiting her in the worst way. Mr. Harvey, however, was simply judging her capabilities, as was evident by the way his eyes skimmed away from where they ought not linger. Rather than bestowing comfort, however, that realization cinched a knot around her hope, nearly severing it. She was taller than the average woman, it was true, but nearly half the width of the other bow maidens, a fact that was not in her favor. She took a step forward. "I know I ain't be as stuggy as the other maidens who be spallin', but I can do the work, sir, I can." Mr. Harvey rubbed his jaw. He needed further convincing. Gwenna peered up at Papa with a silent pleading. His jaw twitched. Gwenna wouldn't blame him if he dragged her right out of the count-house with a severe scolding. In truth, she probably deserved it. Fortunately, Papa blew out a heavy breath and faced Mr. Harvey. "'Tis true, sir. Gwenna be stronger than she looks. She be the finest at spallin' you'll ever see, a keen eye for breaking the ore down, and she be determined, as he can see now." Gwenna bounced up on the tips of her toes at Papa's hidden smile. He didn't want her working at the mine, that much was clear, but Papa had never been able to hide his pride in his daughter's strength, even if it went against his wishes. Finally, Mr. Harvey leaned toward his book again. "Very well. Mary Hawking has left us, so we are in need of a replacement in spalling." Gwenna bit the inside of her cheek. She knew full well her friend Mary had recently married and quit the mine to live in St. Ives with a new husband, leaving a vacancy at Wheel Favor perfect for Gwenna. But Papa didn't need to know that. She avoided his suspicious gaze and focused hard on the words Mr. Harvey scrawled in his book. She could only slightly recognize a few of the letters. G, W, Y. He continued to write as he spoke. "I suspect you won't have a problem working hard, being your father's daughter. But if you struggle or can't keep up with the ore given you, know that we will have to move you to bucking." If that wasn't motivation to prove her work ethic, nothing was. "Will you be ready to start next Tuesday?" A vein of disappointment cut through her excitement, but she nodded anyway. She dared not test her father or push the mine captain further by telling them that date conflicted with plans she'd made weeks before. Mr. Harvey wouldn't care, and Papa, well, this was another piece of information he didn't need to know. Ever. She would simply adjust her plans and continue in silence. After Mr. Harvey finished instructing her about the certain rules of the mine she'd been abiding by since she was a child, they bade farewell to the mine captain and made to quit the count house. No sooner than they reached the door, however, did it swing wide open, causing them both to take a quick step back. 2 gentlemen entered the room. Gwenna recognized the first as Mr. Trevethan. She'd never spoken with him before, but had often seen him from afar, as she'd visited with Papa during his breaks. "Merrick, my apologies," Mr. Trevethan said, after noting he'd nearly hit them with the door. "I didn't know you'd be in here." "Not a problem, sir." The second gentleman, no doubt a new investor, moved out from behind Mr. Trevethan. At first glance, Gwenna was rather struck. Not dumb by any means. She was not the sort of woman to fall down at a man's feet. But to say she didn't admire a handsome face would be an obvious lie, and he certainly had a handsome face. Straight nose, firm jaw, distinguished cheekbones, dark eyes below even darker brows. No doubt the bow maidens outside stopped their chatting when he walked by. "Did you have business with Mr. Harvey?" Mr. Trevethan asked, glancing between the mine captain and Papa. "Yes, sir. We be asking for me daughter Gwenna to return as a maiden." Mr. Trevethan shifted his attention to Gwenna. "Excellent news. We'll be happy to have another Merrick with us." Mr. Rosewall, the previous owner, very rarely came to the mine, and he never spoke with the miners, let alone the bow maidens. Now Gwenna knew why Papa spoke so highly of Mr. Trevethan. "I thank you, sir," she responded. Her attention wavered for the smallest moment toward the younger gentleman again. She pegged him to be in his mid-20s, and found his eyes on her. One side of his mouth turned down, but not in a frown. It appeared more as if he were attempting to hide a smile. What did he find so humorous? The raggedy fabric in her hair? Had she dirt on her face? She'd almost prefer him to blatantly ignore her, as Mr. Pinnock had done. Papa inched toward the door. "Excuse us, sir. Break's nearly over." He'd never been comfortable around members of the upper class. Whether he thought he wasn't deserving of their company or vice versa, Gwenna wasn't entirely certain. Of course," Mr. Trevethan said. "Only allow me first to introduce to you my son." "Son?" Gwenna glanced between the 2 gentlemen. There was hardly any resemblance, unless she counted the darkness of their eyes. "He's finally come home after all these years in Bath," Mr. Trevethan continued. "Jack, Merrick is one of the finest workers we have here at Favor." He clapped his hand on his son's shoulder. "And I'm sure his daughter will be now, too." Jack Trevethan shifted away from his father, causing Mr. Trevethan's arm to fall to his side. Gwenna caught a quick, uncertain glance pass between them before she dipped her head. "Good to meet you, sir," Papa said, his hand on the latch of the door. The younger Mr. Trevethan didn't respond. His brown eyes traced the scant walls, the grim stretch of his lips replacing the shadow of a smile he'd nearly revealed before. He was clearly finding fault in the room she had just admired for its cleanliness. By the side of a silk green waistcoat and spotless cravat, he was no doubt used to extravagant ballrooms and lavish furnishings, something Gwenna had only ever admired from afar. That, of course, would change for an evening not too far from now. The click of the door Papa had finally opened drew her attention away from the gentleman once and for all. Papa excused himself swiftly, then slipped through the door with a nod of his head. Gwenna promptly followed without a glance back. She didn't have time to dwell on the mine owner's son, nor his disapproval of anything less than lofty in nature. She had far more important things on which to focus: providing for her family, doing well with her upcoming work at the mine, and soon attending a private ball, somehow, without her true identity being discovered. Heaven help her. The door closed behind the miner and his daughter, but Jack Trevethan was still too preoccupied with the state of the room to really notice. Father had said they'd made vast improvements to the count house. If that was the case, how must it have appeared before? The walls hardly kept out the wind, and the roof no doubt leaked fiercely during storms. "Come, son, come meet our mine captain, Mr. Harvey." Jack followed Father across the creaking floor as the mine captain stood and allowed Father to take his place behind the desk. Could they only afford one for the both of them? Perhaps they should have made that improvement instead of the minute bedroom Father had boasted of as they'd approached the count house earlier. "I trust you are enjoying your time in Cornwall, sir," Mr. Harvey said after they'd been introduced. "I am, thank you." Was Jack's indifference apparent? He'd always preferred Cornwall and its views to Bath and its crowds, but the bustling city had 2 clear advantages. It was far away from Father, and the women there were plenty. Although some of these bow maidens weren't half so bad to look at. He blinked away a pair of amber eyes and placed a polite smile on his lips. "It is good to be back for a time." Father straightened in his chair. He obviously hadn't seen through Jack's lies, still buzzing after their walk around Wheel Favor. Jack shouldn't be surprised at Father's joy in the mine. He hadn't stopped going on about it since Jack had arrived in Cornwall the day before. Father clearly had a great deal of pride in his new endeavor. He spoke of his love for it as if it were a second child, or his only child. Jack, however, most certainly was not enjoying himself. He never would have agreed to quit Bath for Cornwall in this forsaken mine had not his conscience spoken to him. his conscience that sounded suspiciously like Mama. "Go to him, son. He wishes to see you." Jack had started ignoring this voice more than 12 years ago. The last time he'd heard it aloud. The last time he'd seen his mother alive. But 3 years had gone by now without any interaction with his father. It was probably time to see to his duty for a week or two. "This here's the logbook," Father said. "It's where we make record of all the happenings at the mine." Jack stared mutely at the pages of the book through which Father flipped. He'd decided to remain apathetic to the mine so Father wouldn't attempt to bore him with even more details. Thus far it hadn't worked. Why he thought Jack would be interested in a logbook was beyond him. But then, Father didn't really know Jack at all. Sending a son away at the age of 12 to live with distant cousins and only visiting him once a year tended to have that effect. "The new hires are recorded, as well as those who have left us," Father continued. "I think it extremely beneficial to have thorough records, not only for us, but for those who come after. I hope when you take over Favor you will do the very same." He watched Jack expectantly, but Jack hesitated. He didn't want the mine, nor the responsibilities that came with it. Father was the one to make the foolhardy decision to add this to his other ventures, purchasing a second estate in Suffolk and investing in one scheme after another, anything to keep his mind busy. Why should Jack have to take all of this over because it was Father's dream? "Heavens, you could curdle milk with that scowl, Jackie." Mama's voice echoed in the recesses of his mind once again. He was scowling. Mother had always said he had too fierce a frown. When he was angry, she would stroke a gentle thumb into the crease between his eyebrows until it faded away. He was old enough to be rid of his scowls himself now. "Just so, Father." Apparently pleased with Jack's change in demeanor, Father returned his attention to his book. It was just as well. There wasn't any need at the moment for Jack to admit he had no desire to accept anything but monetary gains from his father. When Jack was given control of all financial matters, he'd simply sell Father's shares in businesses. His family estate, though, he'd keep. Mother loved Coffrow Place too much for Jack to ever consider selling it. He'd simply lease the house and use the money to fund the life of leisure he'd planned for his future. A life away from Cornwall, single and free to do whatever he pleased. "Mr. Pinnock was here earlier, sir," Mr. Harvey said as Jack took to staring out the narrow window. "He once again complained about holding our meetings here." Father sighed, rubbing his fingers against his eyes. "I wish I had never accepted his investment. He's done nothing but complain from the beginning." "Indeed, sir." "Have the Emmons agreed to the use of their horse for the whim?" Father asked. How long would they continue in this regard? Perhaps Jack should excuse himself and return to Coffrow Place alone. That would be more entertaining than listening to matters of business. "Yes, and Mrs. Yemen has agreed to allow her daughter to take the job." "Excellent. And Merrick's girl, Gwenna, was it?" Jack's attention slipped back to Father. "The bow maiden? She had to be more entertaining than a logbook." "Yes, sir." "Did you hire her for bucking?" "No, sir. Mr. Harvey paused, sliding his fingers along his jaw. "She was determined to do spalling instead." Father leaned back in his chair, amused. "Indeed." Despite his attempt to remain indifferent, Jack's intrigue grew. Why was the girl's choice so comical? "She was very insistent," Mr. Harvey continued, "and Merrick defended her capabilities. She worked in that position for a few years before she left, so I have hope she will do a fine job. Either way, if she does not succeed, we can move her elsewhere." Silence followed, Father deep in thought as he tapped his finger on his lips. Jack had seen bow maidens from afar on walks with his mother around the Cornish countryside when her health had permitted it, but he admittedly knew very little about them or mining in general. Why was it so strange she would do sprawling, was it? He asked. Father's eyes lit with excitement, but he spoke slowly, as if to prove he wasn't overtly thrilled with Jack's interest in his work. "Spalling, actually," he corrected. "It's certainly not the most difficult job a maiden does, though they're all quite laborious, but it's essential to the economy of the mine. It requires the girls to wield a long-handled hammer to break down the ore. Hence why we typically reserve the spalling to the larger of the maidens, stout, if you will," Mr. Harvey added. "And it takes a great deal of skill to hit the ore in its proper shattering sphere." "I see," Jack said. He tried to imagine the slight bow maiden, Gwenna, brandishing such a tool. She was tall as the regal women he'd known in Bath, and even thinner than they were. It would be a marvel if she didn't fall over. A smile played on his lips. No wonder Father and Mr. Harvey had been amused. Such a thing would be humorous to see. Perhaps Jack would return to the mine after all, if only to see if the maiden could, in actuality, do such a task. He had very little faith that she could. And there you have it. Thanks so much for listening to the first chapter of Near the Ruins of Penharrow. I hope you enjoyed it.